I looked over the edge of the wall, watching the scarecrows as they assembled outside the gardens. The intel hadn't done them justice. I could see a veritable horde of them. They filled our parking lot like a George Romero movie, and I realized that we didn't have a chance. They would pile up on the wall and bury us, and we would never see the real threat the army held. "Get ready," Randy growled, working the slide on his shotgun as he lifted the barrel. His club, the sign of his station, was strapped across his back, and the Brandulo who gathered around us clutched their clubs and tools uncertainly. Some of them had guns too. I was clutching my own shotgun tightly and just waiting for the push, and there was a collection of revolvers, shotguns, and even a few ARs they had found in Thurston's office. We had stuck the automatics with the most reliable shots among the security detail, and the majority of them had clubs and cudgels. The Queen and her court had called for fuel and fire, and as they lit their arrows, I saw a commotion begin in the parking lot. "Something's out there," I said, nudging Randy. He gave me a "really" look when I pointed out the group coming through the scarecrows beginning to gather up on the south side of the park. That's when he noticed what I had seen. "I think," he said, squinting. "Rolf, turn the parking lot lights on." The lights came up, and the sudden flash made me squint. I could see about a dozen or so armored elves standing off against the scarecrows. They were holding their own for the moment, but the mass of bodies converged on them, and I wasn't sure how long they could last. "We gotta help them," I hissed at Randy, looking around to find some way to get to them so they could come inside. "And we shall," the Queen said, coming up behind me as she raised a hand over her assembled archers. As they lifted their bows to fire, the tips dripping flame as the fuel burned, I saw something else coming to their rescue. An ancient truck came barreling through the crowd, scattering scarecrows as it skidded in the snow. The elves got out of the way, moving so they didn't get squished, and as it came to a stop, I saw a shrunken old man climb nimbly out of the cabin of the truck and move to stand before the horde. When the fire flashed overhead, the rain of flames coming down on the sackcloth bodies, they took the flames like a moth in a lantern. They fell against each other, setting themselves ablaze as someone else climbed out of the truck and went to help the old guy as he prepared to do battle with the scarecrows. That was when I saw him. His orange head was the most noticeable thing about that sea of cast-off scarecrows, and as he ran towards the pair, Randy had to hold me back as I tried to get over the wall after him. I didn't know if there was more of them, but I knew I wanted to shut that stupid pumpkin head up forever. I wanted to feel my stick bite into that brittle gourd and watch it fall apart. I wanted to make him pay for the things he had said about my mistress. Above all else, I wanted to silence the shaking fear that still resided in me at the memory of his taunts in the maze. "Are you crazy? You can't take all them scarecrows by yourself. If they're out there, then they're on their own. We got bigger problems." Another volley went overhead, bathing all of us in light, and that's when they came running for the wall. The sound of stick legs on concrete will likely haunt me for the rest of my life. "We gotta link up with them," Grandpa said, pointing at the armored figures as they held out against the charging scarecrows. Their armor was too thick for the constructs to do much more than scrape against them, but as I came around the group, Grandpa in tow, a group of scarecrows knocked one of them over, pummeling him with their knobbly arms. His fellows had him up pretty quick, but the bruises on his face were a livid purple, even from here. "Not a chance, old man," came a deep voice, and Grandpa threw up his hands as something silver came whistling out of the semi-dark. A wall of air caught the silver bat before it could smash Grandpa's skull in, and the pumpkin leered from behind the translucent barrier as Grandpa pushed him back with his will. He was wearing a ratty black hoodie, the bat he carried full of dings and digs. Whoever was under that mask couldn't have been more than a kid in high school, but when he swung the bat again, I saw his arm flex strangely as he brought it down. When the current of air broke apart, I swept Grandpa aside and imposed my stick in the way of the swing. The vibration thrummed up my arm, but the bat stopped. A live one," the pumpkinhead growled, and as I watched, thick green roots slid up from the sleeves of his hoodie, and over the handle of his bat. "I could use a challenge before I go splatter a few of my master's enemies." He swung again, but I was already moving. I'd pushed Grandpa closer to the group of warriors, hoping they were on our side, and put myself between him and the Pumpkinhead. The legs of his jeans pulsed with the same weird bulges as his arms, and I wondered if there would be an actual arm or leg under there, or if he would turn out to be some sort of weird plant thing. Something with stalks where his limbs should be. Maybe I thought he was nothing but living stalks and roots beneath all those ratty clothes. As he advanced, I pulled out one of my talismans from my pocket, and to my astonishment, the sigil began to grow. They had shown before, but this was the first time it had worked on the first try. The Pumpkinhead stopped in his tracks, cocking his head at the sight of the glowing runes, and I thought for a moment that this might be what Grandpa felt as he put aside evil spirits. I was finally doing it. I was finally finding some control of my power, and as I watched the Pumpkinhead take a step back, I grinned as my magic finally became something I felt I could rely on. When he laughed, I felt some of my confidence waver. The hospital lockdown had advanced to encompass the whole first floor. We had started moving people upstairs pretty quickly after the doors to the ER had started breaking. Fortunately, the night had been light, and there were only about a dozen or so patients in the emergency room. It was the middle of the night, so most of the departments on the ground floor were empty, and after securing their areas as best they could, the staff had turned out to help us. We had tried to call for evacuation, but something was off with the emergency lines. The police, the fire department, it all just rang and rang. EMS, the ones inside the hospital when the lockdown started, were on the 5th floor with us already, and as we all huddled there and watched the security cameras, we wondered if help would ever come. We had been lucky so far, but I didn't know how long it could last. "Anything?" Carl asked me for about the 1000th time. I shook my head. "Well, they haven't figured out how to run the elevators yet, so that's a plus. They're mostly just moving around aimlessly. I'm not sure they have much of a mind about them, and I sure don't know what they're looking for." Carl had declared himself the leader in this situation of martial law, and he'd made David turn off the elevators and told the other 3 floors that the first floor was unsafe for the time being. That went over about as well as you could hope, but the security guys he'd placed in the stairwell reported nothing more than some banging at the door. If they were after something, it seemed it was on the first floor, and they didn't have a lot of interest in the areas above that. Carl snorted. They sure knew what they were doing when they took the ER doors. I wasn't so sure, but as I watched them move around on the security camera, I couldn't help but think they looked a little coordinated. They reminded me of people who are looking for something that they don't really know about, something they aren't sure is actually there. They were paying special attention to areas I had reports of activity in, and I couldn't help but wonder if they were trying to find some of the spooks who lived in the hospital. I mentioned this to Carl, but he just laughed ruefully. "Let's hope not. Don't forget, the really spooky shit is up here with us." "Or in the stairwell," David put in morosely. I turned back to the monitors as the straw men started poking around the entrance to the boiler room. We could only hope they weren't trying to make friends inside the hospital. We had enough to deal with right now. The bullet slammed into the scarecrow and dropped him off the fence as he attempted to climb into Stragview. He fell onto the snow in a heap, his straw head a ruin of sack and chaff, but there was always another one to take his place. Officer Caraway, one of Stragview's best riflemen, sighted up the new climber and put it down without wasting a shot. The warden was glad that she had made it out of the post vehicle in time, and as she fed a fresh magazine into the weapon, he hoped there would be enough rounds. Stragview had so few rifles, and most of the officers he had tasked with defending the perimeter had been given shotguns. They had even fewer hands to hold said rifles, and when the warden had looked out at the 15 members of D-Card who had come to the armory, he hoped it would be enough. It would have been 16, he reflected, if Kelly had done as he was told. The perimeter vehicles had been ambushed as they came back. Most of the drivers had managed to get safely to the control room, each vehicle having 12 rounds to go with a weapon, but Officer Gaffrey hadn't returned from the back 40 of the compound where he had been patrolling. They could see his vehicle sitting by the shed, the door open and the lights still on, but of old Gaffrey there was no sign. Still, 3 out of 4 wasn't bad, he supposed. You all know what the protocol is when the compound is attacked from the outside. Everyone had given the expected response. Once they were on the fence, deadly force could be utilized, even against civilians. Everyone is to arm themselves and protect the fence line. We have protesters on the grounds, and they have been warned that deadly force will be utilized. They've already attacked the post vehicles that are stationed to prevent such an incursion, and these 3 were lucky to make it through the checkpoint alive. The 3 officers had helped add credence to the story, and all 3 of them were pretty shaken by what had happened out there. So, get out there and defend the prison. Spread out, be smart, and if the fence becomes damaged in the fight, be sure to call it in. There hadn't been a lot of questions, and no dissent amongst the assembled COs. The warden had learned 2 things from his time at Stragview. Inmates could be trusted to lie about almost anything, and correctional officers were, for the most part, a collection of functional sociopaths. You didn't even have to count on the normal ones to upset the apple cart either, because most of them could be taught that level of useful hostility with enough time on the job. None of them questioned why the protesters were dressed as scarecrows. None of them had any moral quandaries about shooting people who were trying to get in the prison. At the end of the day, many of them had only been waiting for an opportunity to practice violence on their fellow man, and it was a good thing they were on his side. As he stood in his tower watching the defenses play out, he couldn't help but wonder about the fate of the town. He was sure that his sister was organizing some kind of militia, but as long as the prison stood, he couldn't find it in him to care for anything else. A gleeful little part of him would have been happy to see Cashmere burn to the ground, and he would revel in the knowledge that his smug sister's little shelter had failed. All the same, he did count on the town to provide him with new meat for the Stragview grinder, in one form or another. As the rifles barked and the shotguns boomed, the scarecrows were put aside, and the warden supposed he had to hope for the best where his sister and her town were concerned. There was a soft whump from behind him, and the warden almost chuckled at the lack of stealth. He turned smoothly, pointing his finger like a gun at the creature that had suddenly leapt 80 feet into the air to land on the catwalk of his tower. It was hideous, some kind of pumpkin creature, and its body practically thrummed with life. If there was a human under that hooded sweatshirt, there wasn't much left. The mask it wore was less plastic and more skin these days, he suspected, and as he and the Pumpkinhead eyeballed each other, the warden felt no particular dread from the intruder. He had been more afraid of Jesse's ghost than this hollow creature. So, would you like to tell me why your green man has seen fit to trespass on my property? You know why, the thing hissed, runners of seeds and pulp sliding down its chin. We want the totem, and we want the laughing shadows. They aren't yours, neither one of them, and we want them. Trespassers coming to free trespassers. Sounds like the plot of a bad action movie. You should know you aren't getting either of them. I have the totem, and you can't free the shadows without it. Tell your green man that I'm tired of the attempts of Strange to enter my compound. My people are off limits. My prison is off limits. And unless he wants to join the shadows in confinement, he might want to back off. You don't control the Prince of Strange. More... He never got to finish the word. A lance of flame shot out as the warden splayed his fingers and disintegrated the left side of the creature. It cried out, grabbing the railing with its remaining hand and loosing a cry of agony to the moon. It leaked some strange combination of seeds and pulp, and as it hunkered, gasping, the warden bared his teeth at it. Call me a mortal one more time, and I'll use your corpse for fertilizer in the prison garden. I am no more mortal than you are, you fucking golem, and you would do well to remember that. Go back to your master and tell him." But the creature chose then to launch himself at the warden amidst an expulsion of sound and fury. He was ash before he reached the halfway point, and the remains were taken by the wind as the warden stood posed in his victory. "Warden?" came a call over the radio. "Warden, is everything okay? We saw a bright flash. Are you 10-4? The warden reached for his walkie, wiping some of the char from his shoulder as the wind shifted a little. "Fine, just lit a cigarette. Keep your eyes on the fence." He glanced back at the spot where his enemy had been and found he was grinning. "No worry. I'll just tell him myself then." "Nice try, Chuck," the Pumpkinhead said mockingly, "but that won't work on me. I'm not of your world anymore, and your magic doesn't mean anything in strange." He swung at me with the bat, and I felt the sigil slip from my hands as I was put back on my heels. He was quick, his feet coming down hard and fast as he pursued me. My staff came out, catching the next blow on its length, but he was a better fighter than I was, and I couldn't keep this up forever. Behind me, Grandpa was throwing up walls of air and force he used to defend himself, to keep the scarecrows back, but it was doing little but buying time. If I didn't find some way to end this soon, they would rush us and bury us under their numbers, and he knew it too. "Keep your eyes on the fight, Chuck, otherwise something might slip through." His bat slipped up the length of my stick, smacking my fingers and sending the air whooshing out of me as it smashed into my stomach. I fell on my backside as the Pumpkinhead prepared to brain me with his shiny club. "Kid!" yelled Grandpa, he and the warrior still holding out against the tide of scarecrows as another wave of flaming arrows fell on them. In that light, I could see the glee on the terrible face of the Pumpkinhead. "What you gonna do now, Chuck?" he asked, swinging the bat straight for my head. I raised a hand, pleading for my magic, and when his swing was slowed by my pathetic facsimile of Grandpa's shield, I breathed a sigh of relief. The Pumpkinhead grinned too, clearly as surprised as I was. Well, well, well. Looks like you're just full of surprises, Chuck. Too bad your magic isn't strong enough to stop me." He went right on grinning until I put a hole in his head with the .38 I had in my pocket. "Then it's a good thing I had other tricks up my sleeve," I growled, watching a trickle of pulp and seed slide sickeningly out through the newly formed opening. He shook a little, his eyes trying to look at the hole as his legs lost purchase. "Good one, Chuck," he half-whispered, falling backwards bonelessly. His head smashed on the concrete as he hit the ground, and there was a sudden change in the assembled scarecrows. They turned as one to look back at the fog, and I thought for a moment that maybe the Pumpkinhead had been the one controlling them. As a shadow came clip-clopping from the fog, and my breath felt like it might freeze in my throat, I realized he was just the opening act. He was huge, 12 feet in the saddle, and the axe he carried over his shoulder looked big enough to fell a man in a single stroke. His green armor was the color of spring moss, and the eyes that burned from his helmet were the coals of a deep winter hearth fire. He seemed even bigger as I stared up from my backside, and as his voice boomed over me, I began to tremble. "Winter has come for you, O Lady of Summer. Winter has come." You're still here. Thanks so much for joining us for tonight's spooky tale. If you'd like a little bit more spooky in your life, why not click on one of the videos that appears at the end of our story, or maybe head on over to one of our playlists where you can get your fill of spooky content. If you like your spooky a little more tactile, I've got a new book that's come out. If you'd like your own copy, there's a link below in the description where you can get your own copy of my spooky book. If you like what you see here on the channel and think you might like to support in a more monetized way, then why not come over to Patreon or become a member on YouTube? Speaking of, let's go ahead and thank our members now. Thanks to Civ Garstad and Unicorn Hollow for being our spooky ghost contributors. Thanks to Saikat, Lee Kendall, Janet, and Chris Kinsella for being our spooky skeleton tier contributors. And, of course, thanks to Xaronan, Winter, Tyler Parker, Stephanie Carrington, Sarah ASMR, Hi Stacy, Emily Coltsfoot, and Cinnamon Fox, and Bella Lee for being our ghostly reader tier contributors. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you. As I said, if you'd like to have your name read out at the end of every episode that I make, and maybe get a little more, come on down to Patreon and sign up, or become a member on YouTube. Ghostly Reader tier contributors get a book anytime I write one, which is usually about twice a year. So, what are you waiting for? Come on down and give it a look. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.